when 9/11 happened, it was just chaos all over. And we're watching it unfold, we're watching the television, because we have high school, so the high schoolers were watching. And I was at the alternative school, and at the alternative schools we have a lot of diversity in our student body. And unfortunately, as American society does, is after, even before the dust was settled, they're blaming one particular ethnic group. And so this was a great teachable moment, because what we did is we talked about it as a class. And because I had some Muslims and I had a variety of kids in my class, which is wonderful when you can get such diverse backgrounds. And so we talked about it as, well, what does the Quran say, and what does the Bible say? And so we had this wonderful moment where we exchanged information, and I felt like the students came out of that class period with that teachable moment better understanding what the news was saying, and they knew that the people were accusing people of falsities. And so this was the perfect time that we were able to talk about it and understand that, hey, we need to really be careful for what we hear on the news or we hear from people's biases.
I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is a much different place than here. It is one of the most diverse cities in the country. We have about 8 or 9 different ethnic groups in the city, or on the island of Oahu, and none of them is actually more than about 20% of the people. So everyone is a minority. And when you have that kind of a situation growing up, it does tend to put things in a different perspective. On the other hand, it's a very insular environment. It is an island, it's in the middle of the Pacific, it's thousands of miles from anywhere. So for those of us who leave Hawaii and go live someplace else, it actually changes your perspective again. It reminds you that the things that you grew up with, the things that you come to regard as what is kind of not necessarily normal, but how it's what's expected of everyone is a lot different for other people. I was once asked to give an example of a story about how that might be, and I remember telling someone about how even eating rice was a big difference, a big change for me. When I grew up, in my culture, Japanese culture, you eat rice, you don't eat rice by putting a lot of stuff on it like butter. And when I went to visit my cousins in Michigan, they started putting butter on it. And that just totally blew my mind. For me, the idea of putting butter on rice was completely outside of anything I'd ever known. But by the same token, my cousins couldn't imagine eating rice without it. And I was reminded that it helped me appreciate how other people see the same thing differently, how you have multiple different points of view.
For example, I have a student who came from China, and he was speaking about the public transit situation here in the United States and how, compared to the country that he came from, our public transportation system was very archaic. And so he was saying he might have to wait for an hour and a half to take a bus to get to school or to get to the grocery store, whereas in his home country, transportation was very accessible. On the opposing view, we have students who come here and find that there are so many opportunities, whether it's going to the grocery store and having a choice, whether it's just basic things that we take for granted, like the type of protein that you can buy or the type of cereal that you can buy. It can be very overwhelming. And so when students are able to share their story, it does allow the students who take things for granted to see it through the lens of someone who may not have that same opportunity or that same history.
My background is very interesting. Not many people realize this, but I came from a single parent who struggled. She had no college education. She barely got out of 10th grade. And that was pretty, somewhat typical in the Midwest when I was growing up in the early 60s, late 50s. And so, but what my mother did was she bought me that book every single week because she said, I want you to read these books. I want you to learn about what the world is like. And knowing the hardships that a single parent has faced, as with me being the child, of course, as I've grown up and I'm in the schools, and unfortunately we have many students that come from lower income families and families that barely can make ends meet, children that come to school hungry, but our society is trying to fix those problems. And so I encourage the children, my students, they're not really children, they're young people, to really take advantage of their education, because they can be anything they want to be. It doesn't matter where you came from. What matters is where you're coming into the future. And so here I am today, and I've done a lot of things in my life. I've had the opportunity to go to school and to get graduate degrees, and my latest feat was writing and publishing a book. And so I share these students this information with the students, and they're amazed that here I look like I'm someone that may have had some entitlements and some silver spoons, but in fact, not.
Raised during the Civil Rights Movement. I remember how different things were in my world. My mother and father were both born and raised in Philadelphia. My dad joined the United States Air Force, and his first assignment was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My parents became Catholics, and I didn't know for years why they became Catholics, because both of them come from African Methodist backgrounds. And I just found out a couple years ago that they turned Catholic because they did not want their kids to go to segregated schools in the South. And Catholic schools, everyone could go to the same school. So that's why they became Catholics.
So I came from a single parent home with 3 older siblings, and my mother struggled to provide for us. And in that environment, it required that we became very creative and that we were problem solvers. So I'm very solution-based, and so as a problem comes to me, I think it through, I listen to all sides, and then I'm able to be very decisive, which sometimes can be seen as a negative because people think she's very impulsive, whereas I'm just very confident in the decisions that I make, because for me it was a game of survival. And as I went through education and as I went through high school, I learned that this was really my path for success, and the more education I gained, the more opportunities that became available to me. And so for me, I was the first in my family to have a college degree, to get a master's degree. I finished at Johns Hopkins University, which for my mom was something that she never would have predicted for me, or never even anticipated was something that I could be capable of. And so my goal is to pass that along to students, to let them know that when someone says something is not possible for you, my answer to them is watch me go.
Teaching in the classroom, when you know that there are other people with different points of view, helps, because there are multiple different ways of approaching things. I had learned early on in my teaching career that if I could know something about the culture of of my students, it would help me make certain decisions. In some cultures, it's better to approach mom first if there's a problem in the classroom, and in other cultures, it's better to approach dad. So if I have that information available, I try to use that to make my decisions.
You know, I had my own experience working with a little teacher in Bangladesh in a small village, and I was trying to learn enough to be able to talk in Bengali. I was also teaching at a little school there. And I remember sitting with that dear man, and he said 4 different words to me. One meant egg, and I forget the other 3. And by gosh, I couldn't hear a difference among any of those 4 words. And that kind of keeps me humble when I'm working with my students, where I think, come on, can you hear this? And maybe they just can't yet, but it will come.
With my adaptive physical education class, I have varying degrees of disabilities. I have intellectual, I have physical, I have medical. So it's very diverse range of abilities. And in trying to teach a basketball unit, you do the best you could do to teach basic skills. They learn how to do a bounce pass. They learn how to do a chest pass. They learn how to dribble. But how do you implement that into a game with teammates? And in my situation, I had a group of boys who volunteered to play basketball with my students. And to see my kids, it's not that they were pretending, because in their world they were real basketball players. And so when I said, okay, you're on that team right there, they would run out and slap 5. I'm on your team. So that was a good thing for them. And they learned how to play the game, and they wouldn't have had that experience if they were excluded. But by being